So, I don't often like focus in on a certain specific person in my history classes. I did for Ben Franklin way back at the beginning, and I will every once in a while just to talk about somebody who made like a really big impact on American history. But we got to talk about Thomas Jefferson, because I think of all of the Americans, I think he's probably one of the most famous. We'll probably talk about a couple others, Jackson and Lincoln too, for the same reason. But let's talk about Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson is a product of the Chesapeake Bay colonies. He has an estate called Monticello, and he is a product of that Anglican aristocratic life, okay? That's an important thing for you to remember as we go forward, because he is two different things. He is a product of the Chesapeake Bay colonies with all of its Anglican-like priorities, with all of their aristocratic ideas, but he's also an Enlightenment thinker, which means he's somebody who believes in all those, you know, individual rights. He's somebody who really loves John Locke with his life, liberty, and pursuit of prosperity thinking. So he's a very contradictory person. Thomas Jefferson hates the idea of large government. He hates the idea of government being involved in people's everyday lives, but he never spent a moment of his adult life not in the government. He was in the government from the time he was a young adult to the time that he died. So he hated the idea. He hated the idea of government being involved, but he was always involved in government. He was extremely highly educated himself, but his education wasn't always very practical. Like, he was good at thinking higher thoughts and writing about them, but not always good at implementing the more practical day-to-day things. He believed in equality for all men, but he also believed that some men deserved more rights because they were more intelligent. Some people naturally deserved to be in charge, specifically because they were more intelligent. And he hated the idea of slavery, but he owned a lot of slaves, because Monticello was a plantation with hundreds of slaves at it, okay? So even though he hated the idea of slavery, he still owned slaves. He was a very contradictory person. So we're gonna talk a little bit about his life and how he got there. Before we do, I want to focus in for a second on that idea of how he felt about slavery. Thomas Jefferson owned a plantation in Monticello that had hundreds of slaves. And we're going to talk about some specific slaves that he had because they factor into his life quite a bit. In his writings, this is what he believed about slavery. He believed that slavery as an institution was evil. He believed that that there was nobody who could own slaves that would not eventually turn into a bad guy themselves. There was no way for a slave owner to stay a good person. He believed that owning slaves was inherently dangerous, that keeping a group of people enslaved would naturally make them turn against you, which is pretty smart thinking when you think about it, that over time, eventually that resentment would boil over and they would turn on their masters. They would have no choice. He believed that slavery was incredibly difficult to get rid of. Slavery as an institution had grown to the point where you couldn't just set the slaves free, because if you did, they would turn against you and the economy would collapse. And besides, he also believed that the slaves themselves were vastly inferior. If you read his writings, when he talks about the enslaved people, what he says about them is they lack the ability to be educated. They lack the ability to grasp how government works. They can't really be a part of our society because they're inferior. So he believes that slaves are naturally, as a race, that the African people are naturally inferior. And therefore you can't just set them free and make them citizens. What they really should do, according to Jefferson, is take a place to the west and set it up as a place for slaves to have their own country, set them free and send them there. Because there's no way, nothing is more certainly written in the Book of Faith that these people are to be free, nor is it less certain that the two races, equally free, cannot live in the same government. Nature, habit, opinion have drawn indelible lines of distinction between them. There's no way for the African people and the white people to coexist, in Jefferson's opinion. So he writes extensively about this. And a matter of fact, when he was writing the Declaration of Independence, one of the things that he wrote into it was actually a caveat for setting free the slaves, which then had to be deleted in order for people to agree to sign the Declaration of Independence. So he's a contradictory guy. So let's talk about how he got there. Jefferson was born in Virginia in 1743. At 5 years old, he was already admitted into the English school, which is like the school that, now you remember the Chesapeake Bay colonies, a lot of people were educated by their own families because they treasured the idea of the aristocracy. But if you had a particularly gifted young scholar, you wanted to send them to school to be taught, directly. So he was enrolled at 5 years old, and by the time he was 15 years old, he had over 2,000 books that he had bought and read himself. He was hungry for education. He was absolutely voracious for his education. When he was 15 years old, his father died, and he inherited Monticello. More than Monticello, he actually inherited 5,000 acres of land. Monticello is just the house. But he inherited this plantation that was really huge, including all of the slaves that were attached to it. So at 15, he was already a plantation owner. From the time that he was 15 to the time that he was 17, he traveled and he met and interacted with people. One of his favorite groups of people to meet and interact with were Native Americans. And he was enrolled in 1759 at William and Mary College. So he was pretty young. I mean, he was 11. I mean, he wasn't 11 because he was born in 1743. Sorry, he was 16 when he was enrolled in college. And this was the best college that the South had to offer. William and Mary College was, it was comparable to like Harvard or Princeton, but it was in the South. So he began his academic career in 1759. And while he was there, he was introduced to a science professor who introduced him to the ideas of Isaac Newton and John Locke and Francis Bacon. And he also met Patrick Henry, who was a patriot, who was a rebellious, give me liberty or give me death patriot. So early in his life, in his education, he began to meet people who talked about Enlightenment ideas. So he became a lawyer in 1767. And he argued 7 different cases in favor of slaves who were suing their masters for freedom. And he won some of them. In one case, he did a case pro bono for a slave. And when the slave lost the case, he gave him enough money so that he could run away. Okay, so just so you know where he kind of stands on the issue of slavery, he doesn't even really know. But just so you know, he argued for the freedom of the slaves that he represented. But he also owned this massive plantation. He owned Monticello, which was a plantation that owned almost 230 slaves, I think. So he, from his position in Monticello, he got into politics. I hear you, Jordan, I do, and you're gonna just really love where we're going with this. He got into politics and began to help in Virginia politics. He drafted the Virginia Constitution, and he was the governor of Virginia from 1778 to 1780. He was also a diplomat to France. He loved France. He was so in love with France that he couldn't stay away. He would go and then come back and then go again immediately. He loved to hang out in those salons and talk philosophy. He loved the French court life. He loved all of the things that France had to offer. So as an adult, he was married to Martha. That was his wife's name. And he was married to her from 1772 until 1782 when she died. When he married her, she had a large inheritance from her father's death, which included 143 slaves. So she brought slaves to Monticello when she married Jefferson. One of those slaves was actually a woman by the name of Hemmings, who we're going to talk about separately. Martha and Jefferson had 6 children together, but only 2 of them survived, 2 of the daughters, Martha and Polly. So basically he had a happy marriage to his wife, and they had 2 daughters together, sort of. From 1775 to 1800, he worked in American politics, and he left his wife a lot. He left home a lot. He very rarely traveled with her. And yeah, we're going to get to that, I promise, Jordan. He took frequent trips to France, and on one of those trips, his slave, Sally Hemings, brought his daughter, Polly, to him in France in 1787. And that's the beginning of a branch of Jefferson's story that people really like to talk about. So we'll talk about it. Sally Hemings. Okay, take a look at this family tree and see if you can follow it. Okay, this man, John Wales, had 2 daughters. One of them with his wife, Martha Epps, was his daughter that he had with his wife, and one of them with his slave, Elizabeth Heming, okay? So he and his wife, Martha, had Martha, and that was his daughter, Martha Wales. And Elizabeth Heming, his slave, had Sally, okay? Are you with me? So technically, these 2 women are half-sisters, okay? Thomas Jefferson married this one. He married Martha Wales, John Wales's white daughter. He married the one that he had with his actual wife. But when she came to live with him, Sally Hemings was one of the slaves she brought with him. She brought with her. Okay, so Sally Hemings moved into the household as a slave, even though she was actually Martha's half daughter. Are you following me? This situation isn't that uncommon, but it's probably not as common as people think it is. But the fact of the matter is that Thomas Jefferson had a slave who had come with his wife, who was technically his wife's sister, half-sister, because her father and his father were the same man. Her father and her father were the same man, sorry. And then he had a relationship with that slave. So with his own wife, Martha, he had 2 daughters that survived. And with his slave, he had 4 children. Okay, now there was a controversy about this for many, many, many years. There were lots of people who did not believe that these children were actually Thomas Jefferson's children. In 1998, they did a DNA test on the descendants of Sally Hemings and found a direct connection to Thomas Jefferson. There's also all kinds of anecdotal evidence. Jefferson took Sally Hemings to France, and 9 months after she was in France, she had children. So like the relationship between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings is almost certainly exactly what it looked like. At his death, he wrote into his will to free only 5 slaves, and they were all either children or grandchildren of Sally Hemings. He also kept her in her own house on his property, and she never married anybody else, which slave marriages were complicated to begin with, but they weren't legally recognized to begin with, but a lot of slaves did it anyway. They had common law marriages. Sally Hemings never did, and yet she had 4 children, one of whom looked a lot like Thomas Jefferson, enough like him that he had him serve in the dining room, and guests would remark about how much like Thomas Jefferson this one particular slave boy looked. So in 1999, for the first time, the Monticello Association, which is a group of people that are direct descendants of Thomas Jefferson, and they meet every year to celebrate the fact that they're related to Thomas Jefferson, invited 35 relatives of Sally Hemings to participate. And this is a photograph from that. This is the 6th generation descendant of Sally Hemings. And this is one of the, I think, 7th generation descendants of Thomas Jefferson. And
he looks so salty.
He does. He looks so unhappy to have that branch of the family there. But it's a huge branch. There are over 100 of them, people who are descended from Sally Hemings and, according to the DNA evidence, Thomas Jefferson. So this was a real relationship that he had. He probably thought it was a relationship of love. He probably was actually in love with Sally Hemings, and he probably believed that she was in love with him, but it was a master-slave relationship, so we can't ever know how much agency Sally Hemings actually had, how much choice she had. We will never know. Chances are she probably had very strong feelings about Thomas Jefferson, but it doesn't matter because he had so much authority over her that it could not have been a completely consensual relationship. So, yeah. So let's take a look at what's going on in the world in 1800. Napoleon Bonaparte has taken over. The French have basically imploded in revolution. They killed 30,000 of their own aristocrats, and then they tried to put a government together and they couldn't. The only stable branch of government in France was the military, which was led by Napoleon. So Napoleon stepped in and became the Emperor of France. He was crowned by the Pope, and he was crowned just in case anybody wanted to doubt his intentions. When he was crowned, he didn't wear the French crown. He wore a Roman laurel wreath on his head, just to let people know that he didn't intend to just be the King of France. He intended to be the next Caesar. So he put the French crown on his wife at his coronation and wore a Roman laurel wreath himself. that's kind of what's going on. At this point, he's still just a general, but that's what's going to happen in the near future. France, which Jefferson really loves France, he really loves France, is going through this massive upheaval, and Napoleon Bonaparte is stepping into power. So when George Washington decides that he's not going to run for election in 1796, John Adams wins the election by a fairly slim margin. Between 1796 and 1800, John Adams makes a lot of big mistakes. One of them is the XYZ affair. It's not a mistake exactly, but he disintegrates the alliance between France and America, and he passes the Alien and Sedition Acts, and he doesn't have any really big accomplishments that really give America any kind of foothold in trade. He doesn't do anything that really grows America.
Kind of sounds a little familiar.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, he has a 4-year presidency where he made a lot of, he was basically taking the mantle from George Washington, but he didn't know what to do with it. So the election of 1800 is pretty tight. It's pretty close. Remember, at this point, everybody that goes into election gets to cast 2 votes. That's it. They just get to cast votes for their 2 favorite people. For the last 2 elections, everybody cast 1 vote for George Washington and then 1 vote for somebody else. And the last one, most of them, by a very slim margin, cast their 2nd vote for John Adams. Now we've got an election where we've got 4 people running. 2 of them are people that call themselves Democratic Republicans, and 2 people who call themselves Federalists. And that's John Adams. This is Thomas Jefferson, and this is Aaron Burr. And this is George Pinckney, which you don't really need to know that much about. There's almost no chance that John Adams is going to win. Almost everybody believes that John Adams that they've lost faith in John Adams. So the question comes down to, which one of these 3 people do you cast your 2 votes for? One of the things that happens in this election is that Alexander Hamilton goes on a letter writing spree and begins to send dozens and dozens of letters out, telling people that Aaron Burr is incredibly dangerous because he has no principles, because he has no, he's an opportunist. Now, just to backtrack a little bit about who Aaron Burr is, if Jefferson is a product of the Chesapeake Bay, Aaron Burr is a product of Massachusetts Bay. He is a descendant of John Cotton, the preacher that got kicked out of his congregation because by the time he was done preaching, people wanted to commit suicide. That's his grandfather, okay? But his parents were landed, wealthy people in Massachusetts, in New York, actually, in the Massachusetts Bay Area. They were landed, wealthy people. So he himself grew up as an entitled, wealthy person, kind of a trust fund baby. He actually grew up as a product of wealth. And while he fought in the Revolution, he moved from post to post to post, trying to seek a way to advance himself. When he got into politics, he switched parties because that gave him the opportunity to. So he didn't actually believe what the Federalists had to say or the Democratic Republicans had to say. He just figured it was his best chance to win if he was a Democratic Republican. That being said, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson were like arch enemies. They were arch nemesis. They fought in the cabinet when they were both in George Washington's cabinet. They never stopped fighting with each other. But when it came down to an election about who to cast your votes for, if you're not going to vote for John Adams, which nobody is, then given the choice between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr is more dangerous. Hamilton writes in his letters that he believes that if Aaron Burr is allowed to become president, that he will change the law so that he can stay president for life. He doesn't believe Aaron Burr wants to be president. He believes Aaron Burr wants to be king. So, and he writes letters massively to a lot of people to say specifically that. And that might be true because after this is over, Aaron Burr is going to go on to join another man in a scheme to create his own country in Texas and actually try to declare independence from the US. So he might be right about that. But mostly what Aaron Burr is an opportunist. So in the election of 1800, it's pretty close. Jefferson and Burr each get 73 votes, and John Adams gets 65, and Charles Pinckney gets 64. The Electoral College has to re-vote, and when they re-vote, Jefferson has a majority. but it's still pretty slim and it's still pretty close, but Jefferson actually does win. But as a result of that, Aaron Burr gets to be his vice president. Because that's how we do that. That's what happens when the electoral votes have two. During his first presidency, Jefferson makes sure to pass a law, the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, actually. He doesn't pass it, but the legislative body passes it, to make sure that when we vote, we don't just cast two electoral votes, we vote for somebody for president and somebody for vice president. And just to safeguard now, from this election on, the people that are running for president choose somebody to run for vice president. Okay, so when the Electoral College votes, they could technically vote for a different vice president than the one that the president is running for, but they never have, not since this time. So this is the last election where presidential candidates don't have running mates that they pick out in advance because of this, because Jefferson got stuck with Burr. Okay, so on the night before he left office, John Adams appointed 42 judges before midnight of his presidency. And I just shut off my thing. Oh, that's sad. Y'all gonna have to wait for that to come back up. To the three people in the classroom, they just lost their presentation.
It decided to be picky again.
I just leaned against it and I shut it off with my hands, actually. But okay, so I'll talk about this for a second and I promise I'll come right back to you. But in the midnight before he lost his position as president, John Adams appointed 42 judges. One of them was James Marbury. And when Jefferson got into office the next day, basically, he said, I don't think I want these to be the judges that are running. I think I'm going to not honor those appointments. And Marbury sued. He sued the Chief Justice of the United States, Madison, and said, I was promised a court position and I get a court position. That's how this works. So what happened is that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court read the Constitution and said, there's no place in here that says, okay, there's no place in here that says that if the President of the United States appoints a federal judge, the next president can undo it. The Constitution protects the right of presidents to appoint judges. So John Adams' appointment gets to stay. That was the first case in which the Supreme Court used the Constitution to make a decision. And that's how the Supreme Court decided what its job was actually going to be, that they were actually going to use the Constitution to interpret the law. And then that's what they were going to do from then on. Okay. I'm so sorry, guys. I don't know what to do about that. Well, okay, if this isn't going to come back, do y'all have the Zoom link on your phones? You want to go to the Zoom so you can see it until this comes back?
Just join us.
Yeah, just join the Zoom from right where you're sitting.
Everybody can be in Zoom.
You can stay. You can just, keep it on silent and join the Zoom so you can see it. Sorry about that. I hope it'll come back. All I did was lean against it. Oh my gosh, I hate this room. Okay. Anyway, so Jefferson set out to immediately undo everything that John Adams had done. He didn't believe that John Adams had the right to have an act that puts you in jail for bad-mouthing the government, because that was a violation of the First Amendment. So he immediately repealed the Sedition Act. He immediately repealed the Alien Act for the same reason, because the only way you can decide somebody is a dangerous foreigner is if you search and seize their property without their permission, if you if you hold them in prison without a due process, and all of those are violations of the Bill of Rights. So he believes that those things that John Adams did were wrong to begin with. So he sets out to immediately begin repealing those things. He also immediately begins reducing government spending and taxes. He doesn't believe the federal government has the right to collect as much taxes as it does. Remember, he believes in a small government. So he begins to reduce government spending, which at this point, what mostly government spending is doing is getting the states out of debt. Mostly what it's doing is supporting things like farm debt and things like that. So the other thing that he does is severely reduce the military. He believes that the federal government has too big of a role in the military, that there should be state militias. that the federal government's military should not be used so much for enforcing state laws. It should be used just for when we get into a war with a foreign country, which we're not in one at the moment. So why do we have such a big military? We'll grow our military when we need one. But he does establish an officer training school at West Point because he believes that the best way to invest in your military is to train officers. And then when you have a war, recruit a bunch of people for those officers to lead. So it's good to have really well-trained officers. And also that's in Virginia, which benefits his home state. And he turns most of the government's attention to France instead of Britain. I'm going to reboot it again. He turns the attention of France to France instead of Britain. He doesn't want to establish a trade relationship with Britain. He wants to establish trade relationships with France because he loves France. He is very, very into France. He believes in the French ability to, you know, interact with Americans better. And he's sort of still kind of resentful about the way the British have acted over the years.
But didn't Adams like kill that?
Say again?
Didn't Adams kill that wonderful French love?
He ended the alliance treaty that had been negotiated between America and France. Jefferson wants to bring that love back, especially after they stop fighting amongst each other and they start to rebuild their assembly and their directory under Bonaparte. He believes now that they've stopped, you know, guillotining people, that there's a possibility for America to have a good relationship with them again. He didn't actually believe them guillotining people was a deal breaker anyway, but that's a whole different story. As a result of his relationship with France, that provides America with a unique opportunity. As Bonaparte is starting to lose power in the West Indies and starting to expand in Europe, he sends agents to ask the French if they can please purchase New Orleans. Because if they could have this port city in New Orleans, I don't know if this is gonna work. If he can have this port city in New Orleans, then they can control some of the trade coming into America, okay? But if not, then the British are gonna get a stronghold and then they'll have the British at their back doors. So he sends agents to offer to purchase New Orleans. When they make the offer, Bonaparte takes a look at what it is that they actually are offering and offers for, and he doesn't do it himself, his agent does it. They offer $10 million for the purchase of New Orleans. James Monroe goes to negotiate with it. And the French offer them the entire territory of Louisiana for $15 million. So he goes with $10 million to offer to buy New Orleans, and for $15 million, they're willing to throw in their entire North American holding, which is a big chunk of the center of North America. Part of the reason for that is because Napoleon is trying to send his troops further into Russia, into Poland, into Germany. He's trying to take over the entire European continent, and he needs his troops there. So what this territory has in it right now are a bunch of indigenous people, a bunch of Native Americans, and the French troops are basically just too busy to monitor it anyway. So he turns it over to America. He can reposition those troops so that they're in Europe, and he doesn't have to worry about it anymore. They have just had a slave uprising in French holding in Santo Domingo, which is now Haiti, and the French failed to put that revolution down, that slave rebellion down. So the French troops aren't doing a lot of good, useful work in the American colonies anyway. So they come to Jefferson with this proposal and they say, do you want this $15 million deal? And Jefferson has a big problem now because the Constitution doesn't actually say that the president has the right to buy land, that the president has the right to make this decision. So Jefferson has to weigh his 100% only what the Constitution says, I'm not going to abuse any powers, against this incredible opportunity to grow the country by twice its size, basically. He eventually negotiates and allows that to happen. During his first term, he loses his vice president because his vice president gets in some trouble. Aaron Burr challenges Alexander Hamilton to a duel. And they have to do it in kind of a weird way because duels are illegal in some places and illegal in others. So basically, someone sends a letter to Burr telling him that Hamilton is out there.
It's still legal in Texas.
well, but we don't have a Texas yet because it's only 1800.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's just illegal now.
I think it's illegal in all 50 states, actually. But somebody can fact check me on that. I don't think there's any state where it's still legal to have a duel. I don't know. But anyway, the point is that somebody sends a letter to Burr telling him that Hamilton is basically bad-mouthing his abilities as vice president. Burr sends a letter to Hamilton saying, you need to take that back. Hamilton refuses to take it back and says, I'm not sure exactly what you want me to say. I agree with everything I said, so I can't really take it back. And so Burr challenges him to a duel. They meet on the battlefield, and this is misrepresented in a couple of popular culture areas, but it is actually customary when two men are fighting a duel, if they're gentlemen, to fire over each other's shoulders, to miss on purpose. It's not firing straight up into the air, it's firing over somebody's shoulder. The problem is that Burr is a crap shot. He actually is not a good shot. So when Alexander Hamilton fires over Burr's shoulder during this duel, and Burr tries to fire over Alexander Hamilton's shoulder, he actually manages to shoot Alexander Hamilton right between the ribs. So he hits him in the liver. He's immediately moved back across the state line into New York, where he dies. So because he was shot in New Jersey, where it is illegal to duel, but he actually dies in New York, there are no charges filed against Aaron Burr for the death of Alexander Hamilton. So Burr returns to work. He just goes back to work. He's like, okay, so that's done. And he goes back to Washington. So in the election of 1804, Jefferson chooses a running mate to run against so that he doesn't get stuck with Aaron Burr again. And that running mate is George Clinton, is his name. And we know very little about George Clinton because he basically exists just as a running mate. I hate that y'all can't see this. It's really bugging me that you can't see what I'm about to show you. In order to prevent Jefferson from winning the 1804 election, certain parties begin to try to do a media thing against him in the media, and one of the ways that they do it is through political cartoons. So I want you to take a look at this political cartoon called The Philosophic Cock, and that's rooster, just so you know. A philosophic cock refers to a rooster. But this is a cartoon that's published in papers in 1804. And everything about this picture is supposed to badmouth the Jefferson. So there are lots of things being represented here. There are lots of things that you can see. One of them is that Jefferson is, I tell you what, Zoom people, take a look at what this picture shows. What do you see? What are some of the things that you see here?
He is friends with the Middle East.
What makes you say that?
They've got a turban.
Okay, who's got a turban?
The hen.
Okay, so who is this?
Oh, who is in power at that time?
It's a hen. Who is the dark-skinned hen that is standing beside Thomas Jefferson?
Oh.
This is Love Affair?
Yeah.
Right, this is Sally Hemings. Okay, I know, I'm sorry. I tried to make it come back, it won't come back.
It's got very masculine features.
Well, this is a common headdress for a slave, though, for a female slave.
True.
So, okay, so he's pictured here with Sally Hemings. All right, so he's a proud rooster who's pictured here with Sally Hemings. Do you see anything else?
The title sarcastic.
Yeah, there's a quote from a play. It says, "'Tis not a set of features or complexion or tincture of skin that I admire." And that's from a play about a man that was pretty popular. It was 1703 was when the play was written and performed, and enough people would have known what it was even in 1803, because they would recognize that this is a play about a man who is incredibly wishy-washy, who gives a lot of speeches but never makes any decisions, who falls in love with somebody he's not supposed to fall in love with, and makes a mess out of his role. It's a tragedy in which a man basically implodes. So enough people would have recognized that. The other thing is the rooster is actually a symbol for France. So in your assignment, I want you to pick apart this picture. So you're going to have more time to look at it. It's on Blackboard, and there's a little bit of an article for you to read. Let me see if I can get to it.
No, he's more dedicated to friends.
Let me see. Hold on. I'm so sorry to Angel and Agnes and Joseph that y'all can't see this. I'm sorry I broke the technology. I promise I won't do it again. I can't promise I won't do it again. I try really hard not to do it again. Okay, so under your bold experiment here, there's an article for you to read called The Philosophic Cock, which is an article about this cartoon and has some background for you about Sally Hemings. So I want you to take a look at that. Here it is in a bigger, get out of my way, in a bigger form. So you can take a look at that article, and then I want you to look at the picture closely and find as many details as you can that give you an idea of why they thought this would be such an insulting thing to publish about Thomas Jefferson. They really thought that cartoons like this would probably make it so that he couldn't win the next election. They really did believe that. So try to figure out why, and that's your assignment for today. He won the election in 1804 by a landslide. The only person that ran again, he and George Clinton ran together. So right off the bat, the electors didn't have to figure out who their second vote went to. If you were voting for Thomas Jefferson, you were also voting for George Clinton. That was right off the bat, the easiest thing about the election. And the person that he ran against also had a running mate, and neither of them, Charles Pinckney, who ran in the 1800 election too, also picked a running mate, Rufus King, and they got 8% of the vote. So 92% of the vote went to Jefferson, even after they tried to impose this sort of hatchet job. Okay, so Jefferson has a couple of things that he does during his second term that are kind of important. One of them is to prohibit the importation of slaves in 20 years. Okay, so he passes an act that's going to prohibit the importation of slaves 20 years from now. So in 1807, he passes it. So in 1826, it will start to be illegal to ship slaves from Africa into America. The only slaves that Americans are supposed to have are going to be the ones that are born there. So you can have the slaves that you have. What happens as a result of that is because they're going to come to an end in 20 years, there's a massive importation of slaves. And then people begin to invest in ships that will smuggle slaves more effectively. Okay, so his decision to pass this act, which prohibits the importation of slaves in 20 years, actually increases the slave trade quite a lot because people rush to get their slaves, and then they also try to find new and more interesting ways to smuggle slaves. And it becomes less important that the slaves survive the trip and more important that they just arrive and are smuggled onto American land. So he actually manages to increase the slave trade by trying to prevent it. He also launches what's called the Corps of Discovery, and we're going to talk about that on Monday. The Corps of Discovery's whole job is to explore this new purchase, this new piece of land, the Louisiana Purchase, to try to find the flora, fauna, zoology, and geology that are available in this new piece of land that goes across the Mississippi and all the way over to the West Coast, to try to find a way to get to China by boat, maybe by taking one of these rivers and then floating across, to find what natural resources are new, because it's a nice big enough piece of land that they might find things that they hadn't found before, new crops that they can grow or new things that they can mine, and to make alliances with the natives. So those are the points of the Corps of Discovery. He also sends somebody to the south in an expedition, and that's Pike. And this is all stuff that we're going to cover in detail on Monday. But these are all things that happened during this president's second term in office, during Thomas Jefferson's second term in office. So we're about 5 minutes from the end of class. I apologize again to the three of you. You got shortchanged so bad during this class. I'm so sorry. But do go back and look at the PowerPoint when you get a chance. How about anybody in Zoom? Y'all got any questions? I've stopped sharing, so you can turn your camera on.
No.
Well, okay, so going into this lecture, I'm curious because y'all are Gen Zs. Because
I'm
y'all are
not-
millennials and Gen Zs, what was your opinion of Thomas Jefferson going into this lecture?
I already knew some of this stuff, but I'm not a Gen Z.
No, you're a millennial.
I actually didn't know that he had slaves. I thought he was basically, well, I obviously knew they was against him. I just didn't know he like had them actually.
Yeah,
I didn't
and
know he was like a
part of the
principal.
thing is he couldn't release his, even though he felt bad about having slaves, he was so deeply in debt that he needed Monticello to keep making money. So he
Right.
literally couldn't afford to free his slaves without going to debtor's prison himself.
I didn't realize he was such a hypocrite though. Like I didn't know all the different.
That was my.
He probably would not have called himself a hypocrite. He probably didn't believe he believed he was conflicted, but it was all philosophical. It was all up in his head, right? I mean, how you think and how you act aren't necessarily, they don't have to be connected. You can have beliefs and then totally act against them without being hypocritical, right? Yeah. So in my generation, we were raised to believe that Thomas Jefferson was some sort of hero.
Yeah.
And I definitely think my parents' generation, the boomers, were also raised to believe that. And it's interesting as the generations go and more information is available, how much more human Thomas Jefferson is allowed to be.
Yeah.
Because, he wrote the Declaration of Independence. He's a hero. He's an American founding father. But as each generation gets educated, people are less and less impressed with some of his hypocrisy, some of the things that he did.
See, I was that wonderful generation where in elementary we thought he was a hero, and then all this other stuff started coming out, and then in middle school we started learning about that.
Right. So I think the lesson for us as we study American history is that there are no heroes. There's nobody who basically just stands up and does everything right. Every single person that has ever been in government in America has been a human, and humans are flawed. But never take for granted that anybody is 100% hero if they're involved in politics at all. So that's why it's important not to worship our politicians. It's a very bad practice that we have.
Who would you say is the closest to being a hero?
Who would I say is the closest to being a hero? Hold on one second. What did you say? Yeah, I think so too. It's really hard for me to say. I think that there have been presidents who had good intentions that got lost along the way. I do have respect for some of the presidents and some of what they did, but like Abraham Lincoln and FDR accomplished great things, but they also had hypocrisies in their own lives that you can't ignore. So I think a lot of the American heroes are people that never ran for president. So I don't think that any of our presidents have ever been blameless heroes. I think that you can find dirt on all of them. That's because they're humans. So that's why it's important not to worship your president. Very, very bad practice. And I'm not speaking about anybody in specific here. I think it's just as dangerous to worship Biden as it is for us to worship Trump, as it is for us to worship Reagan, as it was for us to worship FDR or Lincoln or anybody like that. So they're all humans. Remember that. Okay, any other questions? Is that a cat tail on your notes, Savannah?
Yes.
Is that an opinion that your cat is trying to express? Because
No idea. She's just comfortably laying here.
okay. All right. So I'll see you guys on Monday and we'll talk about the core of discovery. And hopefully I won't mess up the technology and hopefully there'll be more of you here. But have a great weekend. Take a look at that assignment. Everything's due on Sunday at midnight.
Woo!
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.